Yeah, so what we're doing this evening is looking at talks 8 to 10. So in a way, we've started with sections 1 to 2 are about expanding who you are in relation to the study. Sections 3 to 7 are expanding what you understand to be the nature of the world and who the Buddha is and his place in that world. And then sections 8 to 10 are kind of blowing your mind as to what enlightenment actually is and anything you've ever understood about enlightenment. So it starts off with section 8, ineffable nirvana. And Sangharakshita starts by saying words cannot describe the ultimate experience and cannot be thought about because the principal condition of its attainment is the cessation of thought constructions. So by its very nature, it's beyond rational mind. It's beyond the duality of concepts. So by its very nature, you couldn't possibly say anything about the experience of enlightenment, if indeed you could even call it an experience of enlightenment, which is still terms to describe the inexpressible. And that ineffability got applied to enlightenment itself, the nature of the Buddha and who the Buddha was in reality, and what happened when the Buddha died, what happened when the Buddha entered his parinibbana. And actually, if you look at the text closely, what you see is that the word for ineffable or inexpressible is nisprapancha. And I think it's quite helpful to understand it as nisprapancha, because some of you will be familiar with what the word prapancha means, which is this kind of mental proliferation. And nis is a negative prefix. So it's saying it's not your prapancha. It's not anything about your proliferation and rumination. Because if you think about your own prapancha, everything about our own kind of storm of thoughts and well, you know what prapancha's like. It just kind of circles around me all the time. You know, at the basis of it is what is in it for me? What does this experience mean for me? And that kind of prapancha, referring everything back to myself and my own kind of delusion, cannot get close to what enlightenment actually is. So in a way, we could say that enlightenment is beyond literalism. It's beyond, we take a concept of enlightenment, even the word enlightenment itself, and we squeeze it into our own prapancha in terms of what we want it to be. So Bhante calls literalism grasping an idea of the Arya Pariyasana, so grasping an idea of the noble quest with the intellect powered by craving. So here we get something that's inexpressible, beyond words, enlightenment itself, and we grasp it with our intellect powered by our own craving. So it becomes whatever we want to be. If we're feeling a bit stuck in life, enlightenment is about freedom. If we're feeling really blocked, it's about creativity. If we're feeling a bit dull and a bit unable to grasp anything properly, then I was trying not to use the word stupid, but sometimes I just feel a bit stupid about life. Then you know, enlightenment becomes about this great wisdom. But all of it is basically comes down to the prapancha around enlightenment becomes basically an improved version of myself. Everything that I don't like about myself disappeared, and me becoming me, but a bit kinder, a bit wiser, a bit more creative. There is a really wonderful essay that Aloka wrote, which I'm going to post on our channel, which is called Some Notes on Navigating the Labyrinth of Literalism. And it's full of some very good quotes. And one of them is, how tedious if Dharma practice always conformed to what we expected, and our naive bletherings about enlightenment bore even the remotest relationship to its eventual realization. How wonderful that enlightenment is nothing to do with my own prapancha, because if it was, it would be rather impoverished. So yes, Nisprapancha around the Buddha and his enlightenment is beyond. It's beyond our own literal ideas about it. It's also beyond relativism. So Bhante doesn't talk about this so much, but I do think this is very important as well, which is that a relative understanding of enlightenment and the Buddha is that the Buddha is whatever we want him to be, and enlightenment is whatever we believe it to be. So again, we're putting the idea of enlightenment and the Buddha sort of back on ourselves and our own authority, that there's no objective criteria for enlightenment, that actually enlightenment is whatever the individual wants it to be. So it's a similar sort of area, but instead of sort of grasping an idea of enlightenment, we sort of throw away all ideas of enlightenment, and it's just whatever suits you at the time. So to reach enlightenment, what we have to do is sort of have this really interesting kind of dual process of grappling with the existing tradition, really getting to know the Buddhist scriptures, reading the descriptions about the Buddha, especially from traditional sources, and accepting that we know nothing about it whatsoever. If you actually do listen to Aloka talking about his process of painting a painting of the Buddha, I think that's the kind of process we need to go towards. In a way, he's got the structure of the tradition, and he has to then let go of any idea about the Buddha within the structure of that tradition, which is, I think, what we have to do. We have to grapple with the tradition, try and understand it deeply, let it evoke something for us, and then let go of any ideas that we've got. A constant process of letting go. And that's what these sections are really all about. They're about this constant process of letting go of any old ideas. If we think we've understood enlightenment, then we think we've mastered enlightenment, and we think we've got there, and we are further away from enlightenment than we've ever been. In a way, the closer you are to enlightenment, the more you realize that you don't know. So we've got this nisprapancha, this ineffability of enlightenment, but we've also got the Mahayana tradition, which applies this principle to everything. So it's not just the Buddha, not just enlightenment, not just the Buddha's own parinibbana, which is inexpressible. Everything is inexpressible. There's the indefinability of dharmas, of all phenomena, and the elusiveness of perfect wisdom. So it applies this process of inexpressibility to everything, which is, I find, really, really exciting, actually. You know, what would it be like to see the world as nisprapancha, as to see the world as inexpressible and ineffable, elusive? What if we were to apply that principle to ourselves as being unknown, and to other people as being unknown? If you've looked into the Metta Bhavana as an insight practice, you'll know that the second stage of using the Metta Bhavana as an insight practice is to see that all dharmas are, to see the true nature of all dharmas in the Metta Bhavana. So what you do is you see that you start to view other people as dharmas. And I think in this context, it means to see that all your ideas about the person that you're bringing to mind are ineffable. They're a great mystery. And how wonderful that they are a great mystery. How tedious it would be if other people conform to what we expected, and our naive bletherings about other people bore even the remotest relationship to who they really are, to transpose Aloka's quote. So yes, we can apply this ineffability to the Dharma, to the Buddha, to the Sangha. But what we end up doing is we constantly try to pin those things down. We constantly try to describe the unknown in terms of the known. We try to describe the Buddha, the Dharma, other people, reality itself in terms of concepts derived from our experience of the phenomenal world. So what the Buddha did with this, you know, this was the difficulty in our time. It's also the difficulty of the Buddha's time as well. What the Buddha did about this is he tried to describe the nature of Buddhahood in terms of negation. And Sangharakshita says that his descriptions are conceptually negative but spiritually positive. So we hear about the Buddha being beyond any kind of reasoning, beyond concepts. There's nothing by which you can measure him. He's trackless, beyond greed, hatred, and delusion, extinguished. So there's a constant flow of kind of negative concepts about the Buddha, but we're left with what he calls a spiritually positive residue. Something is left when all these concepts are taken away. It's not that there's nothing. There's something very positive left. And the way Subhuti describes this is he says selflessness has its own positive character. It's not that there's nothing. It's perfumed by something that we can no longer put into words. So generally, the Pali texts talk about the path rather than the goal, but they do describe the goal in terms of negation. And the Mahayana took that even further, where the negations become more systematic, elaborate, and prolix. So we end up with a negation of anything that you can say about dharmas, anything you can say about phenomena. And you end up with the perfection of wisdom sutras, where it passes into paradox. All notions are undone, even the Dharma, even all the notions we have about the Dharma are undone, and we discard old ideas. So there's this continual process of building up an idea about enlightenment, an idea about the Dharma and the Buddha, and then letting those go. So for another quote from Aloka, as he says, in 1976, I formally committed myself to a course of action about which I had a whole jumble of ideas. None of these have really turned out to be of much use, except their gradual abandonment has provided a path of debris, offering the consolation that I have actually moved from where I started. So that's what we end up with, the path of debris, where even ordination, ideas about ordination and who will be as order members and what the order actually is, it's all an idea that has to be discarded. And this is what's going on. This process of discarding old ideas happens in the Pali texts, where the Buddha talks about Nibbana as being unborn, unbecome, unmade, uncompounded. Therefore, there is an escape from the born, the become, the made, the compounded. And it extends from those kind of passages in the Pali scriptures even to the Heart Sutra, which we all know and love, you know, where even attainment is just a provisional concept and has to be discarded. All the skandhas, all the categories of the Abhidharma are slowly discarded. But of course, this has a problem within it, which is the charge of nihilism. A consequence of the method of negation is that we take the kind of discarding of concepts to be realities. So we think that there really is something called the unborn, the unmade, the unbecome, the uncompounded. And therefore we think that Buddhism is just teaching us that there's nothing. That nirvana is just an ending of all experience. And on the Buddha's death, he no longer exists. He's no longer reborn at all. So the charge of nihilism occurs in the Pali scriptures and in modern times as well. In the Pali scriptures, there were these two central kind of problems, if you like. The first one was what happens when we die. And in those days, they said, well, if the vital principle, the kind of energy of life is identified with the body, then when the body dies, the vital principle ends as well. Both are cut off at death and nothing happens. So the Buddha discarded that idea of nihilism, that consciousness ends at death. And he discarded that in terms of the middle way and praticca samutpada, conditioned arising. And there was another great question, which is what happens when the Buddha dies? And the Buddha said, well, it's not that the Buddha and the enlightened being doesn't exist after death, but it's not that he does exist after death. It's not that he's reborn, but it's not that he's not reborn. He rejected this as an undetermined question. And again, he did the same with, is the universe eternal or is the universe finite? The Buddha said, well, I can't answer that. And I can't answer that not because I don't know, but because actually the reality of it is beyond all logical construct. It's beyond all reasoning. It's not that it is eternal, but it's not that it's not eternal. It's not that it's finite, but it's not that it's not finite. So these are the questions that people were grappling with at the time of the Buddha. But I think there's also modern charges of nihilism against the Dharma. In our group today, we heard a story about someone was talking about to one of us about Buddhism and saying, well, does that mean, you know, I kind of really enjoy playing squash. So does Buddhism say I should enjoy playing squash? And I thought, well, that's really interesting, isn't it? In a way, what it's saying is there's a charge there that if the Buddha has gone beyond all desire, then it's saying that all desire is bad and should be ended. And that Buddhism is teaching a life-denying principle. Actually, that was an objection that was raised at the Buddha's time as well, that the Buddhism was life-denying and said one shouldn't experience any pleasure or any satisfaction in life, that all desires should just end. And of course, it's much more complex to that. It's not that you just stop experiencing pleasure in enlightenment. It's saying that, in a way, it's very hard to describe what happens in enlightenment. It's not just an ending of experience, it's ending of known experience. And the goal is not susceptible to logical treatment. It's a reality beyond reasoning. And anything you say about enlightenment, because it's describing the unknown in terms of the known, is going to cause confusion. The Buddha said it's a kind of intellectual tangle that you end up in, a view, a thicket of views, a wilderness, a jungle, a tangle, a fetter of views, full of pain, vexation, trouble, and distress. So the Buddha recognized himself. It's very hard to understand the goal of the spiritual life without getting the wrong idea and thinking that it's nothing. He said it's like holding a snake by the wrong end. You know, if you hold a snake by its tail, it'll bite you. But if you hold a snake by its head, it can't. Buddhism, because of it going beyond reasoning, is open to misinterpretation by its opponents as well as the disciples. So this is why we have to have, in a way, a path of negation. And it's humiliating and it's difficult because it plays into our nihilism. There's a story that Sangharakshita gives in section 9, where he's talking about the wanderer Vajratara. And, you know, Vajratara's putting all these questions to the Buddha, and the Buddha's saying, like, they're indefinable questions. It's not that, but it's not that. It's not anything you can really understand by reasoning. And you can see Vajratara's getting really, really confused. Well, what is it? Do you teach anything at all? And I have a lot of sympathy with Vajratara, because the more you kind of tangle with these concepts, it's a bit like reading the survey. The more you read it, the more you realize that you don't really know what it's talking about. And, you know, that happens to me as well. Suddenly it's like my brain freezes. And I think, I thought I understood that. I'm really not sure I do, actually. And it's good to remember what the Buddha told Vajratara. He's very kind of, I always imagine the Buddha's very, very kind and sympathetic. He said, well, it's hard for you. It's hard for you because you've got other views and other training. And of course, we've got other views and other training. We've got other teachers. And even if it's not an overt view or training, it's the training of our culture, which, you know, gives a strong message of scientific materialism, which is nihilistic, which is that the consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain, and when you die, that's it. So a lot of the teachings can fit into that worldview. We can project that onto the Buddha, or when the Buddha dies, that's it, he's never reborn. Yeah, it's difficult to kind of empty ourselves out fully of all our preconceived notions from our culture to really understand what the Buddha's talking about. And it's worth remembering that both positive and negative terms are negated. So it's not that the Buddha's reborn, but it's not that he's not reborn. And yes, it's important to come back to that, even though all these kind of designations, all these words about Buddhism have to be negated, there is something spiritually positive. There's the positive spiritual kind of flavor of the goal that's left. There's a sense of something beyond. There's this perfume of the transcendental that lingers even through these kind of the path of negation. And with Vajratara himself, you know, he keeps going with the Buddha. I really respect him for that. He keeps going with the Buddha, trying to understand. Finally, he gets it. And he says, a released person is profound, immeasurable, hard to fathom, like the great ocean. And he says he feels like a great sal tree that stands established, pure in its strength. So you really get the sense of like, he's not just saying, oh, right, yeah, no, it's nothing. And feeling slightly depressed about it. The reverse is true. He says it's wonderful. It's like a great ocean, strange and mysterious, full of hidden depths, full of strange jewels and creatures. He feels like a sal tree which stands established, pure in its strength. This is not the sign of someone who's got caught into a kind of nihilist pit. So yes, the Mahayana sutras and the Pali texts use words poetically and symbolically to take us to a purely spiritual world, transcending thought and space. Bhante says we're in the realm of the spiritually positive, a world glowing with colour and flashing with light. So as much as the Buddha seems to have preferred this kind of negative method of setting up concepts and then denying them, I would say he himself was the positive goal. And if you look through the scriptures, Pali or Mahayana, what you find are long descriptions of the beauty of the Buddha, very sensuous and poetical descriptions about the Buddha, about his lotus-like eyes and his conch shell teeth and the way he walked, the way he moved, how his skin glowed with the color of gold. He's asked to stretch his neck like a swan and sing with his sweet voice. His hair is black like silk and his eyes are like sapphires. So we have all these descriptions of the Buddha. And in that place, we're given that kind of positive connection with the goal. So these undetermined questions that the Buddha says, well, it's not really like that, and it's not really like that, they're only answered by becoming a Buddha, or even dwelling with the Buddha, getting a sense of the Buddha. The Buddha himself is an answer to those questions. The Buddha's teaching are an answer to those undetermined questions. The Buddha's teaching, the Buddha himself, the Sangha itself are an answer to all the series of negations. They give the flavor of the spiritually positive, the perfume of the transcendental. See what he has done and see who he was. As Dada Rinpoche said, if you see smoke in the jungle, you know there's a fire. So yes, the last section, well, not the last section, the section 10 talks a bit more about this positive aspect of nirvana, about these positive indications of the goal. And how these positive descriptions of the goal and of the Dharma itself function to awaken dormant spiritual energies of the disciple by appealing to their imagination. There are similes and parables, like the island of refuge within the flood of existence, like a level ground that's found after the forest of ignorance and the marsh of desire and the cliff of despair. Wonderful. It's like a kind of science fiction movie, isn't it? Or I have dreams like this, actually. You know, you're climbing, going through a forest. You know, we get lost, particularly on a walk on solitary retreat, where you can really, really find this. You end up in a marsh. I always end up in a kind of path, I think is a path, and turns out to be a path for sheep, crawling through some tangled thicket, ending up in a marsh, mud going over my boots, ending up having to scramble down some sort of, well, probably not a cliff face, but, you know, some rocks or something. And then you finally end up on the path. Oh, what a relief. You know, so it's trying to talk about that. They're not to be taken literally. They've been taken to sort of emotionally evocative images. And not only sensuous and poetic images, but also abstract and conceptual, the luminous mind. Luminous, O monks, is the mind, but it is defiled by adventitious defilements. Luminous, luminous. What does that mean? I don't know. It's a symbolic indication of the goal of the path, of the mind itself, of the Buddha himself, that's called for by the needs of the disciples to give vision. You know, we need that sense so that we can go for refuge to something. We need a sense of something beyond, but also that resonates with ourselves, that means something to ourselves, that feels beautiful and alive and mysterious, to awaken our dormant spiritual energies. And in later Buddhism, this got described with the distinction between absolute and relative truth. On the absolute level, nothing can be predicated of nirvana. It's a negation of all qualifications. But on the relative level, on the conventional level, nirvana has to be lived. You know, the spiritual life has to be lived and has to be communicated. And we need symbolic indications of the path. And Bhante talks about these two kinds of truth that create a kind of needful tension. I have to admit, when I was reflecting on this again, I thought, why do we need a kind of needful tension? Why is that a needful tension between relative and absolute truth? I suppose we need it because we have to keep questioning, have we really got it? Have we really understand? Because we keep fixing what we understand to be absolute truth into concepts. So, for example, you might have the concept of no self, and you think, well, on an absolute level, there's no self. I remember once being at a wedding. I've got this dread of being in any kind of family party when my mother says, oh, look, we've put you next to the other Buddhist. Partly because I've just never had a positive experience of that. Strangely, we've got nothing in common. But anyway, I was put next to the other Buddhist who was tucking into his beef and could see that I had a vegetarian meal. And he said, well, the thing is, you know, there's no such thing as self, and there's no such thing as, you know, we're beyond duality. And I thought, well, tell that to the cow. You know, we can talk about absolute truth, but the more we talk about it, the more we fix it, it becomes relative truth. You know, in a way, yes, on the absolute level, there's no such thing as fixed inherent selfhood, but we live in this world where we experience a self. And the problem is, the more you think you've understood that absolute level of no self, then the more you start fixing it into a thing. And when you fixed it into a thing, there is this thing called no self. You hold on to it and it becomes just a concept. It's not really the actual experience of that thing. You know, so when you realize the truth of anatman or anatta, then you are filled with the profoundest of compassion. But if you think you've understood the concept of anatta itself as a real kind of thing, a concept that you can grasp and master, you've lost the compassion. It's interesting about the Buddha when he talked about this, because I think he realized that you could fix onto the absolute level of non-selfhood and rarefy it into a thing. And there's this very lovely quote from the early Buddhist Pali scriptures where he says, the monk must look for peace within himself and not in any other place. For when a person is inwardly quiet, there is nowhere a self can be found. Where then can a non-self be found? There are no waves in the depths of the sea. It is still, unbroken. It is the same with a monk. He is still, without a quiver of desire, without a remnant on which to build pride or desire. So not only is there nowhere a self can be found, but there's also nowhere a non-self can be found. So yes, the only real absolute truth cannot be talked about. It's the experience of nirvana itself. And you can see in the history of Buddhism, different doctrines being kind of reified into absolute truth, such as the 4 Aryan truths, the 5 skandhas, even nirvana itself, as meaning a cessation of becoming, becomes an absolute truth. And all the poetical similes, they're all relative, but the 4 Aryan truths, they're the real thing, they're the absolute truth. And the Mahayana had to come along and say, no, even the doctrine of the 4 noble truths, even the 5 skandhas, even your concepts about nirvana itself are all relative. Only the experience of nirvana is absolute. So Bhante says that the history of Buddhism is the history of the setting up for practical purposes of one indication of reality after another, each to be ruthlessly discarded the minute it came to be regarded as true in the absolute sense, leaving behind it a long trail of deposed definitions, the path of debris, a long trail of deposed definitions. And I think we need this process as well. We need to feel the limitations of our Dharma explorations. Sort of see the limitations of how we set up the Dharma. We think we've understood it. This is it. I've understood it. And then realize, you haven't really understood it. And the problem is we can think there's something wrong with us when we do that. We feel a bit ashamed or like, gosh, I had such a provisional understanding. But actually, if you're entering into that path of debris, if you're leaving behind old ideas about the Dharma, then it's working. Then it's working. It's when you've stuck to the same idea for the last 25 years and then berated everyone else for not having the same idea as you, then you know that you haven't really understood. It's better to keep up with these indications of nirvana, of the 3 jewels, of the whole spiritual life as poetry. And this is what happens even with the concept of Bodhi, of enlightenment itself. Sangharakshita talks in the chapter about how the changing associations with the word even of Bodhi, which is the most popular word in a way for enlightenment. How we've got the Bodhi that emerges when hearing the words of a teacher. We've got the Bodhi that emerges when without a teacher and without disciples. And then we've got the Sama Sambodhi, the Samyak Sambodhi, the perfect enlightenment of the Buddha, who starts off a lineage of teaching in an empty aeon. And over time, even the word Bodhi, from going from actually one sort of experience itself, but a different kind of way of teaching and a different way of communicating that Bodhi, becomes absolute distinctions between Bodhi. So even the word Bodhi came to mean different things as different elements of Bodhi were emphasized. The altruistic aspect of Bodhi was emphasized in Samyak Sambodhi. The forest renunciant aspect of Bodhi was emphasized in Pacceka Bodhi. The need to listen and understand and the gratitude from hearing the words of a Buddha to help you gain enlightenment was emphasized in Sarvaka Bodhi. But even the concept of Bodhi is poetry. There's this wonderful quote from the Buddha where, in the text, where he says, "There arose in me vision, knowledge, understanding. There arose in me wisdom. There arose in me light." You know, the Buddha didn't stick to one conceptual formulation of Bodhi. There arose in me vision. There arose in me light, which of course got fully developed into that Buddha figure of Amitabha. So Bodhi itself does not consist in the knowledge of or union with an absolute, but in an understanding of and a penetration into the real nature of phenomena. You're not going to understand it by grasping the concept or even by gaining some sort of union with that concept, but by a progressive understanding of the real nature of phenomena. So, you know, that's what we do. We get a construct of what we understand enlightenment to be, and then we grasp it. We want to be it. But what we will end up wanting to be is our own concept, not the reality itself. Setting up a conceptual construction leads to that grasping, leads to wanting to attain union with our own conceptual construction. So we have to abandon everything we know. We have to abandon everything we know and listen, reflect, and meditate. You know, this is the path, is to really try and understand what the Buddhist tradition is saying about enlightenment, and then reflect on that kind of poetry. Reflect on the poetry, meditate on the poetry, become the spiritual truth that it represents, and leave the words behind. To end with a Sufi analogy, the words will only take you to the shore of the ocean, but to find the pearl of wisdom, you must drown.